afternoon. It's the 30th of June 2024. We're down to his last speech now, last speech of the evening. And this guy, Wrack, he's the General Secretary at Fire Brigades Union, has been since about 2005. Great bloke, great speaker, gets a standing ovation. He's in charge of a great union, great bunch of workers. Nobody wants to go run into a burning building, not even for any amount of money, but firemen do it. The good thing about firemen as a public service, and you see police, there's lots of rogue policemen out there, but I don't think in my lifetime I've ever seen any, or heard of any rogue firemen. Not heard of many going off with PTSD, some at sites they see. Bodies, burnt bodies, kids, car crashes. Proper bunch of men they are. And they've got a proper leader in Wrack who gets a standing ovation. Listen to this.
Well, how do you follow, not just that, how do you follow all those speeches? I have to say, it's been an absolutely amazing evening. It is an honour and a privilege to be here. We're adjusting. It's because I'm taller than John Dunn.
Taller than anybody, Mike.
It is an honour and a privilege to be here on behalf of the Fire Brigades Union and to bring solidarity to Nottinghamshire striking miners. You should be immensely proud of everything you did during that year. You and other NUM strikers who fought for your union, for your industry and for your communities, and you have been proved right by history, and we shouldn't ever forget that. It was an unprecedented struggle. I think, as Ken Loach said in his comments earlier, in the post-war, post-Second War period, we have not seen a struggle like that. But we will need to see struggles like that if we're going to win. As John has just said, we will need struggles and we will need to learn the lessons of that fight if we're going to win. We saw unprecedented victimisation, sackings and criminalisation of whole communities, an utter disgraceful attack by this system and its state on working class communities simply for standing up for themselves. And that fight for justice has to go on. If you look back, and I'm sure everyone's got them, I was a young firefighter during the strike in London, although I'm from Manchester, I'm not a Cockney, you may have worked out. But looking at the strike, there are images that stick in everyone's heads. And one of the ones that sticks with me, I think it's from the village of Fitzwilliam in Yorkshire. And it's of young men with their shirts off, chained to lampposts by the cops in an occupied village. That's the scale of the oppression that was launched and inflicted on our mining communities during that year, and we should never forget it. Those are how they will treat us when we step out of line. Against your union and your communities and your fighters was arraigned the government, the press, the police, the courts, the so-called welfare system that tried to starve people back to work. And the only way to carry on for a year was by working class solidarity from across the community, from across the country. That's the only way that struggle was able to carry on. It's been mentioned, my own union. I'm in a small union, the Fire Brigades Union, but our little story, which some of you will know, is the General Secretary at the time, Ken Cameron. He was fond of a flutter, apparently, Ken. I had a few run-ins with him over the years as a young troublemaker in our union. But Ken went to the bank one day and took out a sum of money. I think it was £100,000 in cash. And he brought along a Smith's Crisps box, and he put the £100,000 in the crisp box and took it to the National Union of Mine Workers, and that's how that particular donation was delivered. But he did apparently, the teller at the bank said, "What are you doing with that cash, Mr. Cameron?" He said, "I've had a good tip on the horses today." I think we need to look at why they launched that attack on this particular union. Because this wasn't accidental. Ken Loach's comments touched on some of this. If you look at trade union membership in 1979, there were 12.5 million workers in trade unions in 1979. 55% of the workforce. If you look at trade union membership today, it's 6 million. That's about 20% of the workforce, and in the private sector, it's about 12%. This is part of a strategy by the bosses, by the ruling class, to undermine working class organisation and working class resistance. And if you look back at the years, to put 1984 into context, we have to look at some of the things that went before. At the 1970s, they say the 1970s were bad. But as someone has already said, it was one of the periods of the most social equality in the history of this country. And we're now living in one of the periods of the most inequality in the history of this country. So let's look back at some of the things that happened. In 1971, they introduced anti-union laws, the Industrial Relations Act. But in 1972, some dockers went on strike and got banged up in prison for it, the Pentonville Five. And overnight, people started walking out on strike. They occupied factories, they shut down the newspapers. And out of the blue, they invented this person. He was called the official solicitor. No one had ever heard of him before in history, but he suddenly released the 5 dockers from prison because they sensed the power of the working class when it's organised. And they were terrified of it. And that was influenced, of course, by the NUM strike in 1972 as well. And then in 1974, the NUM strike. And the other side, our enemies in this society, and let's call them by the name, the ruling class, they began to think, we need to tackle these people. We need to develop a strategy to take on this movement, this class, and undermine its ability to resist what we want to do. And that is the thinking. And I reread the Ridley report before coming to today. And it's a fascinating document. You can actually read it in the Thatcher archive. And it was a group called the Nationalised Industries Policy Group, led by Nicholas Ridley. And what it showed is that these people are not messing around. These people are serious people pursuing the interests of their class. And they planned that from 1977 onwards. How would they take on nationalised industries? How would they take on well-organised groups of workers? And they particularly identified one particular group of workers, the miners in the National Union of Mine Workers. So they planned that. And it comes on to the question of Thatcher. Come on, boo a bit more. Thatcher. Right, but let's think about what Thatcher was and what she did. Thatcher was a warrior for her people. She was determined to deliver for the people she was in Parliament and in power for. And that was the billionaires, the corporations, the capitalist class. And what we need today is warriors for our class who fight as hard as she did for her class. They set out a plan to take on and undermine the nationalised industries, to tackle the so-called welfare state, to alter completely the housing that people live in, when at one point the majority of people were living in council housing that has been completely and utterly destroyed today, and young people living in the abhorrent situation of the rip-off of the private rented sector. That's the legacy that Thatcher leaves. But a key target in all of that was the trade unions. And within that, they identified one union because of its unique history, its power, and its place within the traditions of the British Labour movement. They identified the NUM as a key target to take on and tackle. And they threw everything at their disposal, at that union and its members, and the families of its members, and the communities of its members. And we saw unleashed a most horrendous, one-sided war, a class war launched by the rich against working class people, using the police, militarised police, using lessons that they'd learned in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. But let's not forget that in the course of that struggle, you transformed things. And I don't say this lightly. You made history. And you should never forget that you made history. You transformed the trade union movement. A union that was overwhelmingly white and male, built links, as you've just heard from Mike, with lesbian and gays. What a remarkable and inspiring achievement to do. You built links with black communities in the inner cities who'd already experienced that type of policing in the early 1980s, in the disturbances, and seen the police launch those similar onslaughts, and the same tactics were now used against the trade union to stop people fighting for the right to work. So in the course of that struggle, you made history. And yes, we have to face up to the sharp reality of the setbacks of that struggle. And the mining industry, tragically, has been destroyed. But, you know, in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be at the Durham Miners Gala. And what a remarkable two-fingered salute to Margaret Thatcher and the Tories, that an industry that doesn't even exist, is able to organise the biggest festival of working class resistance in Europe. What a remarkable achievement. But we're not here there's a place in our movement for museums and memorials, but we're not building museums and memorials. We're building a movement. We're building a movement to fight back and to change things. And our job is to rebuild, learning the powerful lessons of that year-long struggle. And sometimes it seems bleak. And it's always been bleak sometimes, unfortunately. That's life. We have to face up to it, face harsh reality and say, we either accept it or we get organised and we fight back. And I know which one I choose. We organise and we fight back. And you know, I'll finish on just a couple of points, if I may. At one point, trade unions were limited to quite small groups of workers. The mine workers were a bit of an exception as a large-scale industrial union, but other than that, in much of the 19th century, were limited to very elite groups of workers, engineers and so on. And then something happened in 1888. A group of young women in East London working in a match factory, mainly migrant workers from Irish backgrounds, decided that they were sick of the illnesses that they were getting in their workplace. And lots of trade unionists would say, you can't organise people like that. We're skilled engineers. What do we want to be talking to people like that? But they organised the Bryant and May workers, and they fought back, and they won victories, and a year later, they inspired a mass movement of dock workers that created the first mass trade unionism in new areas of industry in this country. And trade unionism spread by the hundreds of thousands. And then in between 1910 and 1914, again, there was another resurgence. Unskilled workers. If we can do it in 1888 and 89, we can do it today with the Amazon workers and the gig workers. That's the challenge that we have with the new generation. Now Thatcher, I'll come back to that. Let's have another boo for Thatcher. Described herself as the Iron Lady. And she had this phrase, didn't she? This phrase that she reeled out periodically. There is no alternative. There is no alternative to her way of doing things. And that was a way of saying, don't step out of line, don't stand up and fight back, don't fight for better wages, don't fight for your jobs, because there is no alternative. Well, let's look back a bit further in history. Their people have always told our people there is no alternative. Their people have always tried to keep our people in our place by telling us there's nothing you can do to resist it. And the only way our people have ever made any progress at all is by completely ignoring them. If we'd listened to them, if we'd listened to people like that, we would never have got rid of slavery. If we'd listened to people like that, we would never have won the right to be in unions. If we'd listened to people like that, we would never have won the right to vote, because they didn't give us the right to vote. We had to fight for it. If we'd listened to people like that, women would not have the right to vote, because they didn't want women to have the right to vote. If we'd listened to people like that, we wouldn't have won the NHS, because they didn't want us to have the NHS. We have only ever made progress when we ignore them, when we talk to ourselves as friends, as workmates, as colleagues, as neighbours, and we think for ourselves, and we organise for ourselves, and we fight back. That's the message for today. That's my lesson from the miners' strike. Solidarity has been a great honour to hear today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. I think we'd all agree we've had some tremendous speakers tonight. Matt,